Hello to another episode of David's Divergent Discussions. I'm your host, David. Tonight I'm here again with Rachel Gavin, who is an independent social worker, and we're going to be talking about the Mental Capacity Act and why that's an important thing to know about for neurodivergent people. Before we start, I'm going to start with some brief audio descriptions. So I'm David Gray Hammond. I'm a 30 Mediterranean man with a shaved head, lip piercing, a beard, sunglasses on because I've lost my regular, and ear stretcher. And I'm sat in a very blue room. Rachel, would you like to do a brief audio description?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Rachel. As David said, independent social worker. Early 40s. I've got brown hair, tied up, and I've got some strange wall behind me, which I didn't mean to do on my screen. So yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting tonight.
Okay, so thank you for being. I think it's going to be a good one because piece of legislation for a lot of reasons. Now, I know some of the people already have an awareness of the Mental Capacity Act, but for people who perhaps only know or are unsure what the Mental Capacity Act actually is, explain as concisely as possible what the Act and what it's meant to be.
Yes, so it's a very complex area. And so, as I said to David just before we went live, that just to give some context, the Mental Capacity Act training that I would do would probably take about 3 or 4 days to cover everything. So there's a lot to cover. So at its very simplest, the Mental Capacity Act is legislation. It's a piece of law and it provides a legal framework. So that legal framework is for acting and making decisions on behalf of adults where we need to, who lack capacity to make particular decisions for themselves. So this law applies to people aged 16 and over living in England and Wales. And what it is about capacity, there's a lot to it, but it's not generic. So it's about sometimes certain decisions. So if a person if an important decision needed to be made, it's not a generic capacity issue with particular decisions only. So it's not that someone does or doesn't have capacity. It'd be different decisions. So what like a person could make a decision in one area perhaps, but not another. Does that make sense? It's not generic.
Yeah. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't assume someone to lack capacity because they're disabled. And there's also a stipulation in there that people with capacity have a right to make unwise decisions.
Yes, so there's the principles of the Mental Capacity Act. So yes, we are to assume capacity. If there are reasonable doubts around, or there's evidence in terms of there's giving you reasonable doubts around a person's ability to make a decision, then there would need to be a clear rationale as to why you would do that, because the first point of call is yes, to assume capacity. And people have the right to make decisions and for us to assume capacity unless there are reasonable doubts. So another principle would be around people must be supported as much as possible, so enhancing someone's decision making. So an example of that might be, as the Mental Capacity Act applies to 16 plus, it might be that a young person will just say 17 years old or nearly 17 years old is struggling to make a decision regarding finances. It might be that the person can manage day-to-day finances, small amounts of money, but when it comes to managing larger amounts of money and bills and things, that might be a difficulty. But where we talk about enhancing capacity, it may be that I'd be working with a young person who people do assume a young person might not have a capacity in a particular area. I might come along and say, well, actually, this might be an education and training need. For someone as young as 16 or 17, it may be unmet needs, and it's to look at, right, how can we enhance this young person's capacity? So in doing so, it could be education and training. It could be looking at the person's communication needs. There's lots of different things that we need to look at, and we need to try everything possible to do so before we're going down the capacity assessment route, if possible. If possible, there are occasions where someone, it could be in the could be, you know, it could be serious, very serious decisions. Now, all the decisions that we look at, obviously some are more complex than others. Some are life-threatening decisions, often very serious. It's really quite a wide range, really.
But the important thing,
And yes,
sorry, carry on.
Sorry, David, you mentioned about unwise decisions.
The important thing is that for each area there has to be a separate assessment, doesn't there? They lack capacity in this area, so in any area.
Yeah, it's precise decisions only. It's not an overall capacity. Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So I believe another one of the principles is kind of similar to the mental health, taking the sort of the least, isn't it?
Yeah. So if well, just an example, if we were assessing someone's capacity about where they might live, then we have to look at the Mental Capacity Act. Under that, if it's been deemed someone hasn't got capacity to make a decision on residence and where to live, we're then in the best interest route and best interest meeting. So within that best interest, what we're doing is balancing the sort of the pros and the cons, essentially, and looking at so if the option is living at home with a support package, or living in a care home, which might be a bit more restrictive for some reason, it's always got to be balanced. And it's the least restrictive option is the one we need to be making sure happens generally, and that the less restrictive, the better, for obvious reasons, as people have human rights as well. We've got Article 8, haven't we? Right to private and family life. There's a lot of legislation around it. So the Mental Capacity Act, best interest, is a big piece of legislation, a very important one at that, especially 16 onwards.
And there are some safeguards in place in that. There was liberty protection safeguards, but that's kind of on hold at the moment, is my understanding. We're still on DOLS, or deprivation of liberty safeguards, aren't we?
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit about what that means, what those safeguards might look like?
Yeah. So if a person who's deemed not to have capacity, and we're talking about residence as the issue, the matter at hand, maybe that if someone was to reside in a care home or a supported living accommodation or something that's more restrictive, the framework around DOLS is unable to leave that property, that residence, and there's quite a lot, might be quite a lot of restrictions on that person, but purely not being able to leave a provision is restrictive in itself, isn't it? So the deprivation of liberty safeguards is a safeguard in itself, where if there's a lot of monitoring perhaps around the person living in the provision to make sure that their provision, their support that's in place is the most least restrictive as possible. That's a very sort of very short summary of deprivation of liberty. But again, that where someone was in, say it was your son or your daughter, you might be instructed as the representative for that person. Not always, but most of the time you probably would be. If you had any concerns about your daughter or your son within a residence and a provision, as a representative, that would be your responsibility to make sure you raise that if it's a significant issue with the court as a representative. So it does give you a lot of safeguards for the person. and for the people around the person who know that person very well. Yeah, sorry.
And much as the Mental Health Act, mental health advocates to help people have their rights met under the Mental Health Act, the Mental Capacity Act has independent mental. When might an IMCA be brought in, and what might their role?
Well, it can vary, but it's usually for more significant, more complex decisions like moving residents. It's usually around residents in care and support, and whether if there's any disputes as well. So there could be a number of reasons, but they would typically be the main areas. But what is usually, if a person is deemed as unfriended, then they would be able to have or need to have an advocate, and they would do so. But a lot of the time, where a person isn't unfriended and as a family member that would be able to act as a representative, they would usually use the Mental Capacity Act and the best interest route then, as well, to go down whatever decision making that is, but in a multidisciplinary with the family members as well, and people who know that person well.
And I mean, something that I wanted to cover here, because obviously I've done my own training in independent advocacy, and I've looked at the Mental Health Act and I've looked at the Mental Capacity Act. Something which I think might confuse people a bit is that people detained under the Mental Health Act are not automatically assumed to lack capacity, and they're still separate things.
Yes.
Where do you think the interplay comes in here? When do you think that perhaps someone under the Health Act might be facing capacity?
So it would always be an approved mental health practitioner would be part of the assessment at the point where they're looking at does or doesn't this person need to be detained. So they might have concerns at that point about the person's ability at that time, about risks to themselves, if it's to do with mental health, and are they able to keep themselves safe. So that might be what they might look at in terms of capacity at that time. And capacity could be looked at any time, whether someone is detained or not. So it can really vary on the situation, but it might be the case where, it could happen at any point, really. It could be assessed at any point then. It really depends on the situation at hand.
And I guess a question that people might ask then, if a person is detained under the Mental Health Act but has not had a capacity assessment, do they still have to submit to any compulsory treatment under the Mental Health Act?
They're two different pieces of legislation. So the Mental Health Act, if they're still meeting the criteria with detention, obviously they would remain under that process then. So they're quite different. So they don't really, they cross over, but they're two separate pieces of legislation, really. So it's a complex area. So it's probably better to stick with either or in terms of talking about that, so I don't confuse anyone.
Okay.
But generally, when someone, so if you think about, we'll talk about the functional test of capacity then. So you've got the diagnostics, you've got two parts to the actual capacity test then. So you've got the diagnostic test of capacity, and what that is saying, is there an impairment in the brain, or is there a disturbance in the brain? Is that a permanent, whichever one it might be? Is that permanent? Is it temporary? So if you imagine that in the context of someone who has become very unwell, and where the Mental Health Act is coming in, in terms of, if it was someone who perhaps did not have an impairment, for example, a brain injury or a severe learning disability, then obviously at that point that's what the act is asking you to look at first, is whether that's there in terms of a diagnosis, or what is it, impairment, disturbance. And then, as I say, is that permanent, is that temporary? So it may be someone that is hasn't got a learning disability or a brain injury, and it could be a mental health concern. So what the Mental Capacity Act is telling us then is can this capacity assessment be delayed? Is if this is not, if there's evidence there of someone might be fluctuating capacity, or it might be because someone is unwell at the time. So if something is temporary, or at that time, can we delay the capacity assessment? We might be able to. So we're not talking about the Mental Health Act here, we're talking about Mental Capacity Act. So if there's a decision that needs to be made at that moment, that person is presenting as really unable to make that decision, but you've got to understand, as the assessor, the wider picture. Because is that the person's normal presentation, typical presentation? Because a few weeks ago or a few months ago, that person may have been in a different situation. So if we think about a spiraling of, there's been a lot of distress. If we think, I'm thinking sort of monotropic split, and when we start the spiraling in mental health, or mental health and any concerns, then really, and we get to that point where that person is so distressed, then that might be an alternative support need. So those are the times we can perhaps look at other matters in addressing unmet needs, providing that support, and delaying a capacity assessment until that time, because the person needs to have that opportunity to have that support and whatever help that they need at that time. So you don't, it's really quite, it depends on the situation, David. It's quite difficult to be precise.
Yeah, but I guess one question that people might ask is, once someone's been deemed not to have capacity, does that generally apply for the rest of their life? Do they have to be reassessed at any point? Can they request to be reassessed?
They can request to be reassessed, yes, and capacity can change. Absolutely can change, yeah, because if I was assessing someone who, at the time of the assessment, the time, and at that very precise time of the assessment, that person didn't have capacity for a particular decision, it could be at another time they may be able to. So yeah, it's not lifelong at all. No, it's not.
Okay, well, it gives people a pretty good idea of what the Mental Capacity Act is doing as a piece of legislation. And obviously, if anyone has questions in the comments, feel free to weigh in. And if we've got time and space to answer them, we will. But obviously, as Rachel said, this is a very complicated area. So bear in mind, we may not be able to answer every question in the space of a live show. But
Yeah.
In Divergent people, because this is David's Divergent discussion, we're here about neurodivergence. Why is this so significant for neurodivergent people as a piece of legislation? Is it something that we commonly come across in neurodivergent circles?
Yeah, so I have a tendency to work more with young people 16 and up, and who, bearing in, and a lot, if a young person or family have to come to me as an independent social worker, there's obviously, there's been a lot happening, there's something wrong, that usually in crisis they've had quite a significant history of unmet needs, difficulties in education, just so much going on, and lots of trauma. So this is the times then that would tend to eventually, I might be coming into someone's lives to provide that support, or a family might contact me. And at that point, we're working typically, unfortunately, with very, very distressed young people after long histories of challenges, a lot of challenges from the world that we live in, really, from the systems that are there that unfortunately don't always help us. So from that perspective, that is typically why I might be involved with working and assessing a young person and an adult, 16 and over. The reason why it's important to discuss with you in terms of neurodiversity is because, again, like not just a mental capacity assessment, but needs assessments, lots of other different assessments. What I find in practice is if you could have the best assessment tool in the world, if you're not assessing someone through a neurodivergent lens, you could say you could have the most amazing assessment tool in the world. You are not likely, on the balance of probability, going to pick up on the wider picture, the person's needs. You're not going to understand necessarily their needs very well and what you need to do and how to work with the person as well. Which is a big worry for me, and not just in this area with capacity assessments. It's the same with adult social care needs assessment. I will do children's social care needs assessments as well. And without that ND lens, you will naturally, you're not going to pick up on a lot of things and understand a lot of things from through the perspective that you have, which you wouldn't have if you're not assessing with that knowledge. So I think competency, I think, keeps popping into my mind a lot around this particular subject, and capacity is an area of concern for me in terms of people who are professionals who are assessing capacity with neurodivergent young people and adults without that lens is quite a concern for me. Just for example, sorry, if I go off a tangent, just stop me. So when I'm doing a capacity assessment, then a lot of the things, if we think about one of the principles, so enhancing capacity, one of the things that I will always do is make sure I have evidence assessments on that person's sensory profile, interoception, I'll tell you why now, speech and language communication needs. So, and I'll use all that evidence and all that support for a lot of preparation beforehand. And you and I know trust, safety for the person. So it's about developing that relationship as well prior to the capacity assessment. But where this doesn't come up in any mental capacity training, which is quite a concern, the simple understanding of interoception alone. And people will say, other professionals will say, what's that got to do with capacity assessments and decision making? Well, you'd be very, very, very surprised. Reason being, if we think about interoception and the ability to feel our own internal sensory experiences, including emotions, there'll be people with impaired interoception might experience a lack of sense of self. They may have a limited sense of how they might feel. They also might experience a lot of anxiety, masking anxiety as well. So interoceptive difficulties, and due to the person, perhaps, how can I explain, perhaps being able to define and describe their own wants, their own needs, their own opinions, can make them very vulnerable to suggestibility, people pleasing, avoidance of certain conversations or decisions making. There can be some vulnerabilities around exploitation. So yeah, interoceptive differences do need to be considered. Incapacity does not happen. So that's just an example of the neurodivergent lens with assessing. So you don't have that wider knowledge, in my opinion, you shouldn't be assessing, because we wouldn't be picking up on some of those things, which is just really, really important.
I know certainly in my own role as an advocate and mentor, the number of meetings I've sat in where I sometimes feel like I'm doing for them because they've come into it with no understanding of neurodivergence, and I'm having to sit there and give them like neurodivergence 101 on the fly, so that they can actually make an informed recommendation.
And this is I get, to be honest, I'd like a bit of anxiety from it, because I'm just think, well, how are professionals doing these assessments? Because it's quite worrying, because they're serious decisions, and if you didn't understand about sensory profile, about interoceptions, and a lot of young people and adults, typically I'll see a lot of fluctuating capacity. So when we think about monotropism, and if you look on your website as well about monotropic split, I know I mentioned that earlier, fluctuating capacity, you need to understand the wider context. And the common themes, typical presentations essentially with young people and adults that I will see. So it's a bit of a scary world out there, really, because it does concern me in terms of who's behind that assessment.
One of the things that really gets me, and I've seen this a lot, and I was discussing it actually with Tanya Radkin earlier today, people will conflate academic ability with ability across the board. So if someone is academically able, they're able all the way across the board, and if they're not academically able, they will assume they're not able all the way across the board. And I always find it interesting how in the neurodivergent community, we understand that people have spiky profiles. You know, we might be really good in some areas and really struggle in some others, but a lot of professionals out there, they kind of just assume we're at the same level with everything.
And it's just like, it's hard to explain, isn't it? But just an issue that they feel is an issue in one area, and then to them it's the same across the board, but it's not the case, is it, at all? And just the simple sort of discussions around how interoception and suggestibility and the need to know about that. It's worrying, really, isn't it? So it must be quite frustrating for you.
People in the comments are agreeing as well. Stan McD says, absolutely agree that capacity assessment needs to be looking at things through a neurodiverse lens, and that if the assessor can't, then they shouldn't be assessing, period. I think there's something to that. You know, you probably shouldn't be assessing neurodivergent people if you don't understand neurodivergent people.
No, and again, I've had a lot of conversations myself with Tanya about it. And she actually mentioned to me not so long ago is, why don't we have specialist teams, autistic social workers? You know, it's just, I just don't feel personally it's doable that these assessments are completed with people across the world of social work and everything else with neurodivergent young people and adults. Without that, they're never going to get it right. They're never going to, it's just, but it's not. How realistic would that be to achieve, you know?
Someone else has weighed in the comments saying, sounds like training needs to take place, or perhaps having an autistic advocate on the team. If I might respond to this quickly, one of the challenges with putting an autistic advocate onto a team of people who are doing capacity assessments, independent advocacy, as soon as they are on that team, they cease being independent. So there's a challenge there in that independent advocates exist. So do we get more autistic people to train as independent advocates, or autistic people on these teams to advocate anyway? There's a question of which way you go about it. In terms of training, I mean, I know I've trained local authorities, social workers, but I think it's hit and miss because it comes through very slowly. I think some local authorities are starting to they should actually learn from neurodivergent people who have expertise in these areas. But it's slow going. I don't know what your experience has been, because I know you're based out towards Wales, aren't you? I don't know what it's like out there, but I found that most of the requests that I see come through from sort of the north of England. We don't see a lot down the south.
Yeah, no, a lot. I get a lot of requests, and I was actually with so you've got boards, so you've got social work England in England, and you've got social care Wales in Wales. And so I'm doing a lot. Wales are particularly keen to learn a lot more at the moment, so they're really on the case with everything in terms of how their services are. They're particularly focused with the issues around CAMS within mental health teams. So I'm finding, because I'm obviously working in England and Wales, I am finding Wales are achieving a lot more. They are getting better. They're nowhere near perfect. But if I had to compare, then there's a lot of things happening in Wales, and things are a lot better here than in England, if I'm honest with you. But again, we've still got a long way to go.
The same person, whilst I was answering about advocacy, chimed in with "Damn, that's complicated." Yeah, that's one of the problems. It is complicated.
Yeah, it is.
But I think we're maybe slowly seeing a move towards better training. I'm not going to say we're anywhere near being perfect, but I see things as an advocate and a mentor. That's not to say we're anywhere near to the finish line, but
I'm just at the moment trying to target the bigger organisations, or the organisations that would govern social workers, that would govern local authorities. They're the ones I'm targeting at the minute. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we can't change it usually, David, on an individual level or individual teams. It's got to just go as far as you can take it, really. So not so much in England, but like Wales and the bigger organisations who govern the local authorities here are really taking an interest in it. So fingers crossed there's going to be a change, and hopefully that'll influence England a bit more as well.
Yeah, and I'm also hoping that if the political landscape changes and priorities shift, more, I don't want to say pressure, but more pressure on local authorities to actually be inclusive people.
Yeah.
I do wonder how much of this lack of input from minority groups comes down to the political landscape we exist within, because whether we like it or not, social work is relatively controlled by politics. That's where the funding comes from. That's where the policies come down from.
Absolutely.
So hopefully a shift in the political landscape, which we can hope is coming. Hope see some improvements with that. But if people wanted to look up things about the Mental Capacity Act, are there any good resource trustworthy?
So, well, I can have a look while I'm on here. There are a few. Obviously, you can go on the main legislation, but actually find Mind have pretty good resources on there, and everything is really well explained as well. So if you go onto the Mind website and type in Mental Capacity Act, it gives some really good descriptions on there and a lot of detail about things. As I say, there's huge. So it'll talk about capacity, best interests. So we've gone over a little bit deprivation of liberty, which is a 3-day training program in itself. So there's a lot to that as well. There's information on there about health and welfare decisions. So the court of protection, that's another area as well. Around someone's finances and future health and welfare decisions, power of attorney, that route. So there's lots on there. One of the things that I will say, though, David, going off topic again, if there is a young person or an adult that you have some concerns about, and sometimes when they've there'd be times where the person might be quite regulated. There'll be other times where they'll become quite distressed, perhaps. And when they're quite distressed, it would be at those times they struggle more to make certain decisions. When it comes to mental health as well, it may be, what I always find useful is a sort of writing that person wishes and feelings down on paper when they are able to, when they are feeling regulated, they are okay, on a good level, really, to have those wishes and feelings down on paper. Why I say that is because where someone, when I've assessed people later on, and they've been deemed not to have capacity in a certain area, like where they live, the care and support that they have, and they're now at a point where they're unable to make that decision for whatever reason, I have then been able to have the wishes and feelings of that person from back in the day where they were able to make a decision, and use that in the court of protection. Because wishes and feelings before that person lost capacity is also an important area. So I would have something on paper written down for that as well. If you're quite concerned about something, that could be an older person, it could be any age, but they're quite useful to make sure
Is
are
this
written
kind of
down.
like an advanced directive?
Sort of, yeah, sort of. And again, it wouldn't, not everyone would need to do that. It would just be probably certain situations and things. But, well, I would personally do that, because if we ever get to a point of court protection for whatever reason, and a capacity issue and a decision, whatever that decision is at the time, if I've got access to wishes and feelings from prior to when that person lost capacity, that has done a U-turn in court of protection for that person,
I know that,
a few times.
yeah. I know that for me, because obviously I'm schizophrenic. I'm diagnosed. I've been in psychiatric hospitals as a patient twice, and one of the things that was done for me was what they called an advanced directive. So
Yeah,
what they did was, whilst I was well, they noted down my wishes and
yeah,
feelings. So it was like the
here
fact that
we
I
are.
would like
Yeah,
hospital to be a last resort, what medications I
yeah,
struggle to tolerate, things like that.
yeah. That
And
must
so
be
they had all
done.
my written down. And it comes
Yeah,
with the caveat that it's not legally binding. So they can, if they need to, step away from what you've written in those wishes and feelings. But it carries a fair
absolutely
bit
they
of
can.
weight.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely they can. But I find that it does carry a lot of weight if I was in the court of protection arena. A bit different in the Mental Health Act, which really kind of depends at the time. But when it's something that's in the court of protection for, say, residents or care and support, then absolutely it has. I say where a local authority and health board have been in the court of protection with a family, perhaps because they're trying to. Unfortunately, this happens where there's someone having a very high care package at home, then from local authority and health board wording, and they're looking to move that person into care home or residence or something. A lot of the time, unfortunately, these things come down to funding when they absolutely shouldn't. Um, I'm thinking of people who've been in similar positions, and obviously then when at that point and they've been deemed not to have capacity in a particular area, and they've got those wishes and feelings in place down on paper that they did before, it absolutely makes a massive difference in the court of protection. As I say, cases have been overturned in the court with that evidence as well. So it's a big
I think that's a really important takeaway for people. Well, it's been really good having you on this evening, Rachel. Just a quick shout out to the if you're on Android smartphone, my website with over 300 articles about autism and neurodivergence is now available as an Android app. You can find details at the link on screen. And also until the 10th of March, so this Sunday, 3 of my books are available for free on Kindle. That's The New Normal, Unusual Medicine, and Cams in Crisis, which is my latest one. Cams in Crisis has been rated in the social work, civil rights and liberties, and another category on Amazon. So I'm quite impressed with that. And The New Normal recently made it to #1 for me. So that was quite exciting. Unfortunately, Unusual Medicine only made it back to you can't win them all.
So, that's pretty good.
But yeah, if you want to access those free Kindle ebooks whilst they're available, you can visit the link on screen. And if you want to access the Android app, again, the link on screen. I mean, there's lots of things if you go to that link on screen. There's like a whole list. You could probably make an evening of it. Open a bottle of wine and go through David's links. Anyway, thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to play the outro video now, and I will see. No one else will see us because we will no longer be live.
Thank you. Thank you.